Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. Kevin, that was really wonderful presentation as everyone's been. So this talk is titled By the Sun and the Moon, Shaping a Sovereign Syllabary for the Lakota Iyapi. How? Chante washte anabe chuyuz apelo. Toka kimwe kahokshula hemie. Bobby Joe Smith III Machiapilo. Unchi Ichiapi ki Makosha Washtenwe na Inawaye Ichiapi ki Tracy Ketterling. Unchi na ina ki Honk Papa no Ohenumpa Lakota Wia. Nana Ichiapi ki Barbara Smith na Atewaye Ichiapi Bobby Joe Smith II. Nana na Ante Hawasapa na Honke Seminole na Honke Cherokee. Iash Maglawa Honke Malakota na Honke Hamasapa Yelo. Los Angeles, El Wati, Iash Ian Waslaha, North Dakota, na Minneapolis, Minnesota, Mataha. Ampretu Kin le Iuha Wopila, Echichiapilo. Greetings, everyone. My name is Bobby Joe Smith III. I'm a Black and Honkpapa and Ohinumpa Lakota graphic designer, creative technologist, educator, and budding type designer. I brought all of these identities with me to UCLA's Design Media Arts MFA program. I'm currently in the studio, and even though it's sunny LA, it's kind of cold. So hope you don't mind, I'm wearing my jacket and my hat just to stay warm. But I brought all these identities with me to UCLA to expand my research and praxis in decolonial poetics, or the name I've been using for thinking through how to use art and design to advance decolonial movements. I feel very grateful for being allowed to speak with all of you. I know that there's an incredible amount of talent, and I know how hard type design is in typography, so I feel really blessed to be able to be here and speak with you. And also greet you in my native tongue of Lakota, allowing me to practice that and continue to build my ability to express who I am through my language. I do so as a way of carrying on a tradition of respect for the space of learning and sharing we are building together. And because before today, many of you may have never heard an indigenous language of this continent spoken before. As is common in the Lakota way, I also introduced you to my parents and my grandparents, my lineage, the people I come from, because acknowledging who I come from not only honors them, it helps others orient their relationship to me, mapping my place within the community, and also lets you decide whether or not you should listen to me or not. So that's all kind of present in that type of introduction. But speaking of my tradition, where I come from, I am the descendant of decorated warriors, healers, horse thieves, fugitives, educators, ranchers, drug pushers, voyageurs, musicians, and much more. And for the purposes of this presentation, I also share this lineage with you to contextualize my creative practice and reasons for speaking on this topic of decolonizing design and how that impacts the way that I approach type design and typography. In 2018, about halfway through my MFA in graphic design at the Rhode Island School of Design, I was introduced to the phrase decolonizing design. It was trending at the time, promising a more just, equitable, and diverse path for the discipline. And I was intrigued. As a Black and Native person, I was raised in the movements centered around decolonial projects. As a Black and Native designer, I've been investigating how those movements fit into my practice. Although I wasn't sure what decolonizing design meant, I understood that graphic design has been shaped by the perspectives, needs, and desires of predominantly white, cisgendered heterosexual men in imperialistic capitalist societies. So the tools, the substrates, the professional networks, the institutions, processes, theories, grammars, and values that have come to define the discipline of design have been shaped from this position. Consequently, graphic design primarily serves the needs of the settler in a settler colonial societies like the United States. Such a reality has prompted many designers like myself who do not fit neatly into this rubric to question the framework of the discipline and our position in it. Over the past few years, the term decolonization has become popular within academic institutions, social media, and elsewhere as a signifier for a variety of social justice and diversity initiatives. And the trend has found its way into graphic design discourse, prompting a declaration from many practitioners to decolonize design. But what does such a demand mean, and what might it require? Decolonization has a specific cultural, historical, economic, and sociopolitical meaning in the United States. It confronts the genocidal erasure of indigenous people for the seizure of land and resources, and the theft, objectification, and enslavement of Black and brown bodies to make the stolen land profitable in a capitalist imperialist framework of valuation. It is important to note that colonization was not an event of the past. It is a system of laws, infrastructure, culture, and ways of being and seeing the world that is deeply ingrained in the fabric of the nation like the United States. So much so that it can be sometimes difficult to discern what all should be attributed to colonization. While the systems and ongoing manifestations of colonization have many contextual permutations that pervade every aspect of life in colonial and post-colonial societies, there is still a general framework by which to identify the system at large. Colonization is a method of empire building in which an entity seeks out, invades, and occupies other lands to expend the wealth, power, and territory of the aggressor. Most often, colonization employs violence through military conquest to subjugate, control, and/or eradicate indigenous populations. After conquest, colonial systems are put in place, such as slavery, capitalism, and policing, to manage colonized subjects and excessively exploit their land and labor to build wealth. Decolonization, therefore, means, to me, the repatriation of indigenous land and life through the dismantling of colonial systems of domination, expropriation, and violence. And it's often the case when colonization is happening, it kind of goes through these stages of reconnaissance, often thought of as, or spoken of as, discovery or exploration, invasion, which is usually violent, occupation, that's taking over of the land, settling the land, building systems and infrastructure upon that land to continue the exploitation and extraction on those lands. And then lastly, assimilation, which comes in the form of both, in some cases, erasure in terms of genocide or cultural erasure, or assimilation, trying to make what is considered the other or the periphery take part in this colonial system. And for the most part, this is the general flow, but smaller projects of colonization also kind of follow these stages of colonization. So for a colonial project like the construction of the oil pipeline, like the Dakota Access pipeline across indigenous lands, there was a process of investigating what land to build the pipeline across, invading the space using military forces, police forces, or militarized police forces to take the land to be able to continue to build the oil pipeline, occupation, the actual building of the infrastructure, the actual building of the pipeline in the ground, and assimilation would be perhaps having us have jobs within the oil fields and whatnot. So it is dangerous to me to use the word decolonization in a way that strips it of that meaning. Professing to decolonize design without the explicit intention of returning land, life, and sovereignty to colonized people undermines decolonial movements by appropriating and convoluting the meaning of the term. The effort to improve representation and access of marginalized groups in design as a means of decentering white heteropatriarchy is a necessary direction for the discipline. But such an endeavor is not equivalent to what decolonization requires. Access to a colonial system is not the same as dismantling it. Design as an intellectual and professional terrain cannot be decolonized through an insular critique separate from a decolonial movement. There is no liberation of the discipline without the liberation of the colonized subjects through the complete dismantling of the colonial systems. So the fate of the discipline and the fate of the people are inextricably intertwined. Therefore, a colonial design practice uses design to advance decolonial movements and in the process locates new decolonial forms symbiotically. A decolonial design practice uses design to advance decolonial movements. There are many in the profession who do not believe design is capable of addressing complex problems such as decolonization. If one were to approach decolonization from a traditional design practice, I would be inclined to agree. However, where some see a barrier, I see a long tradition of people who look like me, repurposing tools not designed for them to meet their own needs. Using design in the service of decolonial movements will require new articulations of tools, substrates, networks, institutions, processes, theories, grammars, and values. This need for new grammars, values, and use cases for graphic design has been the driving force behind my graduate thesis work on decolonial poetics. I think I'll probably pass that part, but my general the start of my practice of thinking about how do I use design to service decolonial projects and decolonial movements really began my first year at the Maryland Institute College of Art. When I started that post-baccalaureate program, it was right during the time when the Dakota Access Oil Pipeline was being built. It was beginning to be built across the Missouri River, across the lands where my tribe exists, about a mile north of Standing Rock. And it was also a time in Minneapolis and St. Paul where the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement was happening. And in Minneapolis, a place that I grew up, it was particularly heating up after the murders of Jamar Clark and Philando Castile. So I found myself, like many other Black and Indigenous people, I inherited this multi-generational struggle to liberate and decolonize the communities I claim and that claim me. And this was a charge I did not take lightly. I am someone's ancestor. I come from warrior cultures that fought against seemingly insurmountable odds for my existence. But many of those warrior societies are all gone now. They've become political councils, nonprofits, and law firms. And the warriors have traded their weapons for briefcases, or in my case, a laptop and an Adobe subscription and glyphs now that I'm a type designer. So in the expansive terrain of this endeavor, I've pursued many paths, both personal and professional: law, public policy, consulting, community organizing, direct action, community service. All of them been valuable experiences that guide my steps to this day. But it was in the act of making, however, that I found the most empowerment and fulfillment, despite being unable to convincingly articulate a practical political application to myself or my family. But I can speak to that better now. I was in the classrooms at Micah and in RISD, and particularly in Micah, and I was trying to figure out, how is what I'm learning in the classroom applicable to the front lines? How can I literally take this new skill that I'm learning and actually have it make a difference? How can we stop getting Black people shot by the police? And how can we prevent the US government and oil companies from poisoning our lands and our water that we've depended on for millennia, that threatened our ability to stay where our ancestors have been buried, in which we've come from that ground. It was a very existential crisis. And I was like, how do we take what we're learning in design, how do I take this profession and actually have it make a difference? And that question has really consumed me and has made me think deeply about, is there a larger role that design can play in helping our communities? In thinking through that, a number of things that sort of came up. You start thinking a lot about identity. You start researching a lot. And even in times when you're in sort of this ivory tower, kind of removed from your hometown or your home community, I found that making was a way to process some of these really difficult questions that I was thinking through, process issues around identity, process trying to find my place within the design profession, the design world. And that was something I did not expect. And that actually kind of made me lean more towards an artistic practice in many ways, where I was completely opposed to before, because to me, design was framed as a way of solving challenging problems. It wasn't meant to be so much about individual expression, but in the working with community, working with another, working with the client to solve problems. So my work, I want to note, is also primarily focused on a form of colonization known as settler colonialism, as it is manifested in the United States. And it is a case in which the colonizer comes to stay. It ruptures the space between the colony and the metropole. And I include in this definition the abolitionist efforts of Black communities, as slavery was an inseparable facet of settler colonization in the United States. It really depended upon the theft of land and the erasure of indigenous people and the forced involuntary labor of African people. So those two things were both required for the process of colonization to occur in the United States, and to remove either of those legacies and not incorporate them together would be missing all that colonization is in this space. So I believe it's really dangerous, again, to use the word decolonization in a way that strips it of what such an action requires in terms of dismantling colonial structures that continue to threaten our communities. The Indian Child Welfare Act, which is being debated within the Supreme Court, is a perfect example of how being able to just protect our children and keep our children in our communities and in our homes is something that we're still having to fight. So this is a continuing, ongoing thing. I'm going to move forward to talk a little bit more. Let me actually see how much time I have left. Sorry. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the type design projects that I've been working on, particularly around the Lakota language. I entered graphic design from the very beginning because I felt that there was a gap. There were people in my community who are knowledge keepers, who are culture keepers, who are keepers of our language, typically elders, who wanted to pass this on to younger generations, but were afraid that that information would be appropriated or stolen or get into the wrong hands, and therefore, maybe didn't make websites or things that shared this information, and they wanted to pass it on to younger generations. And we had younger generations that really wanted to learn this information, including my generation, but felt like we didn't have the resources or the ability to be able to do that. And to me, I thought, well, that's a design problem. If there's an interest and there's people who can supply that information, how do we take it and put it in mediums that both protect and honor that information, but also makes it engaging and gets it to be in the right hands? So simple projects like this project, the Three Sisters project, poster zine that I designed, looks at traditional ways of growing produce. And it's pretty typically well documented about the use of squash, bean, and corn together in this really healthy system that nurtures each one of those plants, helps them all grow, but also doesn't deplete the soil. So food sovereignty is something that really matters a lot in our communities, and being able to have that information. A lot of tribes you can find in their communities on the reservations that they're going back to relearning traditional methods of growing, ways that doesn't deplete the soil, ways that honor the plant beings that we're working with, that honors the territory and the land. So design is a way for me to learn this information as well as pass it on. Literally creating posters for or signs for protest movements that matter to me. I found that one thing that was really needed when it came to working on decolonial projects is that there was an immediacy in which things needed to be created. I liked in school being able to sit and think through things and be really meticulous about where I put type. That wasn't the case on the front line. You don't know what materials you're going to have available to you. And typically it needs to be made right away. So that was like a really a difficult thing for me to cross. But I also found that when making, having these limitations on the tools that I could use and the time that I could use, still sitting down and really being intentional about making these posters was a way for me to process what oftentimes felt like a very helpless situation. Making posters about Lakota star knowledge, understanding how what's happening in the heavens is also happening on Earth, how that's mapped to the land that we're from specifically, thinking about type in the landscape, thinking about the land and trying to connect my design practice and the things that I'm creating with the land that it's supposed to be in relationship to. Those are really like valuable things that I get to do through a design practice. Looking at Lakota myth or Lakota stories about where we come from was something that was really valuable to me, and creating a reference guide for myself as I'm learning about all of these entities, all of these concepts that are embedded in these stories that we tell, being able to share that and be able to put it in our language. This was actually one of the first places where I really realized that type design became interesting to me. When I wanted to start writing the Lakota language, not having the typeface support that I needed to be able to do these design projects became a real issue. And it wasn't something that I anticipated going into design, that there'd be so few resources available for me to be able to write my own language. I just didn't understand how fonts and typefaces really worked at that time. Going into archives, learning. I've also, I'm from Minnesota, I'm from North Dakota, but where I've gone to school has been on the East Coast and right now in LA and West Coast. And of course, when I'm there's other tribes that are indigenous to that area. So I am still a visitor to those areas. I'm not indigenous to that land in particular. And every time that I've gone to these other schools, when I've been in Providence, Rhode Island, or been in Baltimore and been in LA, it was really important for me to learn about the indigenous cultures that were there, the indigenous communities that were there, and the way that they understood that land to the best of my ability, again, as an outsider. But oftentimes when you learn that history, you get a very strong sense of, you get a very strong sense of like the similarities in what we faced. And in learning about that, you can also kind of process some of the things that you're going through on your own. So this is a project that I was working on when I was going through archives, library archives in Providence, Rhode Island, and learning about the methods that were used, like during King Philip's War, some of the early colonies, and both committing genocide and trying to erase indigenous people, but also wanting to record and capture them for an archive, almost like one would a butterfly in a museum or something. It's going to be dead, but at least we get to like look at it visually. And me trying to process seeing them do that directly, whether it was severing body parts and putting them in jars as a part of like a cabinet of curiosity, or inviting Native leaders to Washington, D.C. to have their portraits painted with the understanding that we are going to try to make that tribe disappear and that group of people disappear. So let me at least capture their visage before we continue with that process. That's where I learned early on that archives often are sites of violence and sites of pain for Black and Indigenous people. You look in those spaces and you don't find us whole. You only find utterances or whispers of our existence. This is a project that I collaborated on, in which the words that people spoke into the microphone was mapped to their face. And so you're getting a portrait that's developed off of the things that you say. So thinking about how type and language and what you communicate become part of your identity. I think I'm coming close to the end here of my time. Thinking of experimental ways of publishing or making public, writing became a very important part of my practice in school, really trying to uncover, what does it mean to have a Black and Indigenous practice? What does it mean to have a decolonial practice in art and design? And how do I tell other people about these experiences? As our other presenters have noted, you go into these crit rooms and you feel like you're also educating. You're spending most of that crit time explaining the context for where you come from. So how can I create this act of making public? Who's the audience that I'm directing this towards? And how do I get people on board and in the same way of being able to think and make through these difficult issues? One of the beautiful things about archives, though, I also did find other works by Indigenous designers that really inspired me and literally made me cry. You didn't know that I needed to see myself in this way in the discipline. So a conference like this is really important because it's so valuable to know that there's other Indigenous designers that are working through the same issues that you're working through, that are executing their work at such a high level. Being able to be seen in the discipline that you're passionate about really, really matters. This is a lot of design projects I created are around trying to locate myself in the new territory that I'm in as well, whether it was Baltimore, Providence, Rhode Island, Los Angeles. Photography has been a way for me to try to process that, as has sort of design and thinking through where I am. Collaborative practice has become also really important to me. So for most of us, we are making design work for our communities, and we know how important it is to have a connection to the people that you're making work with and for. So I have been collaborating with Bo Miyuk, who is Indigenous Korean, and she's thinking through her own aspects of what it means to be, Indigenous Korean in a country that has been colonized multiple times by different entities, and how they've been able to maintain their culture, but also what things are they pushing aside to be a part of the global economy or part of the global, the sort of like condensing of culture that's happening through globalization. So we've been creating interactive installations, workshops to be able to talk about decolonial art and design, and thinking about when we go back and work with our communities, how can we use our art and design practice to be able to bring people in rather than create this difference between, oh, I'm an artist or I'm a designer and you're just the audience that passively receives the work that we make. A Forest for the Trees is an arts project that's based here in LA. My cousin's a part of it, Londi Keepseagle, who's really amazing, but works with the Karuk tribe, which is in Northern California, and is interested in this art project in particular, is looking at their land and forest stewardship practices and trying to help people understand not only what it means to steward this type of land from Indigenous people that are from here, but also how do we empower what do we need to do to be able to empower the communities to be able to do what they've done for millennia and care for this space? So thinking through doing design, but also bringing, how do you work with another tribe's culture and visual language in a way that's respectful? I am indigenous, but I'm not Karuk. So, what rights do I have to, use certain symbols or imagery? These are some of the challenges that I think a lot of Native designers have to face, because we kind of get lumped all into the same category. And I'm happy to get these types of commissions and these types of abilities to work on, designs for other tribes, but you're also trying to think, I don't want to replicate the same issues that typically face our communities in terms of appropriation. I'm going to sort of fast forward to a project that I'm working on now, which is thinking through type design. How do we visualize the Lakota language, which has been an oral tradition for millennia? It's a language that's older than English, and we've been able to pass on and build this language without the need for a writing system. If we needed a writing system, we would have built one. But in recent decades, we have needed to start building a writing system in order to record and keep our language in case our fluent speakers pass away. It allow our language to become dormant rather than extinct. So finding a way to write this down and archive has become an important process that community members have engaged in. It's also important to note that initial writing systems in Lakota were created by colonizers, by missionaries, as a way of translating the Bible in order to have us assimilate into Christian culture. So some of the first writing systems were actually used as a colonial tool against our communities. It's not just so simple as like, oh, this is a great evolution, or this is a great, these things are loaded. But this is an early typeface that I created. It was inspired by Sadie Redwing's research, and the point of her thesis of saying it's important to look within your own design culture for the visual language that exists there, and doing your design work. So I was thinking through, what would it look like to at least use some of the tools that were available, the tools and substrates that were available to Lakota people, some of the forms that we saw there, to be able to start designing our typeface. So as you can see with this particular typeface, there's no actual circular movements. I was thinking of quill patterns as a space where visual language was communicated within indigenous culture. A lot of our writing systems were embedded directly into the clothing that we wore, and porcupine quills are rigid. So you couldn't really make these circular, like super organic forms. So this particular typeface uses those patterns that we were seeing in beadwork and in quill work, and limiting myself, instead of thinking of what a pen can do to draw, what could we make with quills? And then it made me think, well, this visual language is typically displayed on clothing, on textiles. So I wanted to start embroidering and thinking about, what does this typeface look on this medium rather than on pen and paper or some other substrate that isn't super well adopted within Lakota communities. I began to play more with this sort of shape vocab that, again, Sadie Redwing was really helping to, bring up this research from that space. And I thought, instead of a square grid and creating our glyphs, what if you had a circular grid? Square is something that feels very settler and colonial. Everything seems to be a square, including the housing that's there. Where in Lakota culture, there was a concept around something being cyclical. Everything was sort of thought of as this sort of like circle and this roundness to it. So instead of a square grid, what if it was the circular, like beading grids that we use to create our letter forms? And if we're not going to use pen and paper, which again, writing and books aren't necessarily technology that are super well adopted within Lakota communities. More reading and writing is probably done on digital devices like the cell phone than in books. So why would we limit ourselves to that technology that isn't super embraced? Can we create some sort of type forms that look to older substrates like beading, and to newer technologies, so computational devices. If we have a computational device, we don't need to have a standardized way of writing, which was the case with some of these previous symbols, which had meaning. These shape vocabs had meaning, but they weren't standardized across every tribe. And I love that variability about our culture. So when we have these computational devices, we could have a database. Everybody could have their own typeface and their own orthography and way of writing their language. As long as it was all in a database, then it could be translated to everybody that they needed to. So I really like this idea of people coming up with their own forms and their own way of writing our language and relating to our language. So these are some of the designs that I were finding, both using a circular grid, which was something that was very different for me, but also in thinking and just sort of like meditating on, you know, what would it mean to make my own typeface and really like have my own way of visualizing the Lakota language. And of course, I ran this exercise with other people to be able to have them start to form their own visual language of how they'd want to represent certain concepts or certain sounds or however they wanted to be able to write Lakota. Let's give them the ability to come up with their own solution. And I will move to the end here. I'm very lucky to be in continue this work and thinking about how to write Lakota, moving away from the Latin glyph, which is a very, it's the visual language of our colonizer. I'm participating in the Practica program. Like I said, I'm a budding type designer, so this will be a way for me to do sort of a deep dive in type design. And one of the typefaces that I'm really looking to build and continue to work with comes from the Leroy Curley orthography. So there's been many orthographies that have been created of thinking about how to write Lakota. Leroy Curley is Lakota, a Lakota person who and designer who created a typeface that was based off of sun and moon phases. And I thought there was something really beautiful and poetic and that connected very closely to Lakota culture to be able to create a typeface and a way of writing our language that really like holds our values and our cosmology is something that's really important. So I wanted to continue to build out this typeface and design, figure out how can it translate well with Latin glyphs, since there are people who do want to write our orthography with Latin glyphs. So how do we give people the choice of how they want to approach that? But just giving some visual understanding of what this sort of orthography looks like. I think it fits very closely with, again, some of the visual vocabulary that already exists within these Plains tribes. If you look at teepees, if you look at the clothing that we wore, there's this really like, there is pattern and repetition, but it also in many ways feels very like minimalist, these sort of geographic forms that are really beautiful. And I think it holds very well traditionally, as well as moving it into the future. So I want to thank you all for listening to me. I know I took up way more time than I was supposed to. But if you want to talk more about this, obviously I can talk on and on and on. So please reach out to me. It's something I'm very passionate about. And have a great rest of the conference. Doksha.